when the Bank of England raises interest rates, they're trying to fix inflation, and I think inflation will come down. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. They're trying to fix inflation, but they're doing nothing to fix the inequality, which is the fundamental problem. And I think this is a little bit the problem with the way economists think. So the Bank of England is raising interest rates. A lot of people are worried about this, what it means. So we're just going to do a quick explainer and what's going on. So the Bank of England is raising interest rates to deal with inflation. I think the most interesting point to realise here is there's a real asymmetry between the causes of the inflation and the attempt to fix the inflation. Okay, so I've talked about it a lot on this channel, so people will know the government essentially gave out £450 billion of cash during COVID, which is a truly, truly enormous amount of money. The way that worked at the time is the government borrowed it from the Bank of England and then they gave it out. And the Bank of England pays interest on this money. So, as I've said a lot, it's very important to understand who got this money, okay? It's explained very clearly on the very first video on this channel, why COVID-19 is making the rich richer, that money was largely accumulated by richer people, okay? So during COVID, the government essentially printed and gave out an enormous amount of money that ended up with the rich, and they pay interest on the rich, on the money to the rich. So an enormous increase in inequality. It was pretty much inevitable that this would always cause inflation, just simply because of the enormous size of it. But it's important to understand that it also causes a permanent cash flow from the government to the rich, because the rich have this £450 billion now, and the government pays interest on the money. It's actually the Bank of England that pays the interest, but the Bank of England is owned by the government, so financially it's coming from the government, okay? So during COVID, the government gave a huge amount of money out. That has been inevitably inflationary. If the government wanted to deal with that inflation, the sensible thing to do, which is exactly what I suggested in the first video on this channel, is they need to take the money back, which is basically taxation. But that's not what they're doing. What actually is happening is that the central bank is raising the interest rate. And remember, the interest rate is the cash flow that the government pays to the rich who have the money. So if you look at what's happening here, in both instances, it's really bad for the government, which is the taxpayer, and really good for the rich, right? During COVID, they gave the rich a ton of money, and now after COVID, they're increasing the interest rate that they pay to the rich on that money. So first, the rich got a ton of money, and now the rich are going to get even more money every year from the government. So from an inequality perspective, and anyone who watches the channel regularly will know, inequality is basically a cancer killing our economy. What's happening is basically terrible, right? A huge amount of money was given, and now more money will be given every year. And that money will come from the government, but also from anyone who is in debt, which is basically if you have a mortgage, if you have a large mortgage. As I explained in our video, What is Wealth? That mortgage is owned largely by richer people. You pay interest to the rich on your mortgage, and that interest will go up. You'll pay more interest to the rich. So when the Bank of England raises interest rates, they're trying to fix inflation, and I think inflation will come down. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. They're trying to fix inflation, but they're doing nothing to fix the inequality, which is the fundamental problem. And I think this is a little bit the problem with the way economists think. They see the inflation, but economists have a massive blind spot for inequality, which nothing could be illustrating it more than the way nobody's speaking about it right now. And they're dealing with the inflation, but they're not dealing with the inequality. So inflation will come down. I'm very confident inflation will renormalise. It might take a year or so. Inflation will come down, but inequality will not come down. And what that means is inequality will be left permanently higher, which will mean that ordinary people's standard of living will be left permanently lower, and rich people's standard of living will be left permanently higher. So inflation will come down, but these changes in relative price levels, mainly that energy prices and food prices and things like rent have become permanent, and also house prices have become permanently significantly higher relative to wages. They will remain. So the central bank will succeed in its target of reducing inflation, but it will not succeed in renormalising your living standards to what they were before COVID. Living standards will be permanently worse now, just like they were realistically after 2008 for ordinary people. Living standards will be permanently worse in this country, and they will continue to deteriorate. So how do you stop that? Well, the way you stop that is to reverse the damage that you did during COVID. During COVID, £450 billion, which is £10,000 per adult, was transferred from the government to the rich, explained in our first video. That's enormous. It increases inequality enormously. You need to fix that. And the way to fix that is by taking money back from the rich, which is taxation. And that would be a symmetrical way of solving the problem. You give money to the rich, you want to fix it, you take money back from the rich. But what we did is we give money to the rich and then we give the rich more money through raising inflation, right? Through raising the interest rate, right? So the central bank they'll fix the inflation, but they won't fix the inequality. And the way to fix inequality would be to raise taxes. But the central bank doesn't control taxation, right? Taxation is in the realm of the government. The central bank only controls monetary policy, which is things like interest rates. The central bank can't tax the rich, okay? So that should fall on the government to tax the rich. Well, is the government taxing the rich? I don't think I need really to comment on that. You know, the Chancellor-in-law's father-in-law is one of the richest billionaires in the world. Sorry, the Chancellor's father-in-law, one of the richest billionaires in the world, doesn't seem to be showing any inclination to tax the rich. Those two things might be connected. They might not for me to say. These guys are not seriously talking about taxing the rich, which means the problem won't get fixed. So inflation will come back down, but living standards will continue to decrease and decrease and decrease and decrease. So then is the Bank of England at fault because they don't control taxation policy? Well, it's not their fault that taxes are not being raised. But what is their fault is there's a lot of very well-paid economists at the Bank of England whose job is to protect the economy of this country, okay? We know now that £450 billion, which is a truly enormous sum of money, went from the government to the rich during COVID. It should be obvious that that's a big causative factor in what is happening now. Who at the Bank of England, of all these well-paid economists, is talking about it? Andrew Bailey gets paid £500,000 a year. He's the chief of the Bank of England. Is he talking about the massive increase in cash holdings by the rich during COVID? I haven't heard him talk about it. In fact, all he said is that ordinary people should not ask for pay rises. Well, I think ordinary people should be getting pay rises, right? So the Bank of England is not at fault in the sense that they can't raise taxes, but they are at fault in the sense that here's a lot of very well-paid economists who should be protecting the living standards of people in this country who have allowed the largest ever and quickest ever transfer of wealth from the government to the rich and have simply said nothing about it. You know, if your job is to protect ordinary people and to manage inflation, and there's an enormous transfer of cash from the government to the rich that causes inflation and damages ordinary people's lives, you should at the very least talk about it, and they're not talking about it. So the Bank of England, look, interest rates, the market expects them to stay at about 2% level and to stabilise there, not ever to go higher because they expect the economy to stay weak. Personally, I think they will probably come up and at some point come back down again, and I expect we will see something like a zero interest rate, probably within a couple of years. That's not what the market expects, that's what I expect. But that's because I think the economy will be very, very weak in the long run. But the most important thing to understand is that even though inflation will normalise, living standards will not normalise. And that's a terrible message, but it's the truth. And the only way to fix that is to tax the rich. Because when you increase inequality, you improve living standards of the rich and you decrease living standards of the rest. That's what we're going to see. That will not fix itself, and we can only fix that by fixing taxation policy. So I would really love anyone who works at the Bank of England or who knows one who works at the Bank of England to get in touch with me and talk about why they haven't said anything about this massive transfer of cash and wealth to the richest. Because I think I would like to say it's criminal, but to be honest, I think it's more a case of just stupidity. I've worked with a lot of economists, and they're not stupid people, but they seem to be phenomenally incurious people. And I would love to know just why nobody has spoken about it. So if anyone at the Bank of England can get in touch and say, you know, maybe someone has done it, and if someone's done it, I'd love to see it. But that transfer of wealth has happened. The Bank of England can't fix it, but they can talk about it. And I really wish they did, because it's getting boring just being me. Good? We done? Yeah.
The richest in our society are making billions off of COVID-19. That is going to keep our economy in a crisis for decades. How many times can you get paid a load of money for betting the world's going to be terrible forever?